May 22, 1945. The bridge at Bremerwörde in northern Germany. The Third Reich has collapsed into clogged roads of refugees. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Third Reich's most terrifying bureaucracy, engineered his own demise through a fatal administrative error. He approaches a checkpoint manned by the 45th Field Security Section. Himmler's evasion doctrine critically fails when he assumes the identity of Heinrich Hitzinger and carries documents stamped by the secret field police. He presents papers identifying him as a sergeant in the Geheime Feldpolizei, secret field police. The checkpoint operators, Sergeants Arthur Britton, Ken Baysbrown, and Staff Sergeant John Hogg, spot the fatal friction. British intelligence had already placed this specific unit on an automatic arrest list. British intelligence had already issued a specific operational order to arrest anyone carrying these exact documents, turning his perfect forgery into a self-executing arrest warrant. By forging papers linking him to a secret field police unit already flagged for automatic arrest, he transformed his meticulously crafted disguise into a legally binding trap. He is ordered into a truck, a silent administrative capture. Ultimately, the man who industrialized mass murder was defeated not by a grand military strike, but by the relentless, unfeeling grind of British checkpoint protocols and a routine medical audit. We often hear about the big battles, but World War II was won on logistics and intelligence. Drop a comment below with one specific technical fact you know about Allied intelligence operations in 1945. Was Himmler's capture a stroke of luck, or the inevitable mathematical result of a superior bureaucratic dragnet? Let me know your thoughts. And if you value history told with precision and depth, hit that like button, subscribe, and join the family. By May 23, 1945, the British logistical apparatus had evolved into a massive industrial processing machine. Civilian Interrogation Camp 031, located at Barnstedt near Lüneburg, was not designed for grand military showdowns. It was a high-volume triage center built to absorb, categorize, and filter the biological remnants of a collapsed empire. Himmler's evasion doctrine relied on a fundamental premise. He believed he could hide within the statistical noise of displaced persons. He failed to realize that Civilian Interrogation Camp 031 was filtering upwards of 15,000 refugees and capitulated personnel every single week, operating at roughly 140% of its engineered logistical capacity. Into this mechanical sorting facility stepped the biological asset claiming to be Sergeant Heinrich Hitzinger, accompanied by 2 aides. His forged documents had already initiated his capture at the bridge, but it was at Camp 031 where his evasion protocol suffered a total behavioral breakdown. Himmler's disguise relied on a catastrophic miscalculation regarding human conditioning. For 12 years, from 1933 to 1945, he had served as the absolute architect of the Schutzstaffel, an organization that had swelled to encompass nearly 800,000 personnel at its peak. Within that rigid, terrifying hierarchy, Himmler held the power of life and death over millions. That level of absolute authoritarian conditioning acts as an irreversible modification to the human psyche. It cannot be uninstalled in a week, nor successfully hidden beneath the rough wool coat of a low-ranking non-commissioned officer. The friction point emerged almost immediately during the standard intake procedures. Camp Commandant Captain Tom Sylvester did not rely on intuition or heroic instinct to spot the anomaly. He relied on the strict observation of military mathematics. In the tightly calibrated hierarchy of the German armed forces, behavioral mechanics are absolute. Yet, Sylvester observed a glaring systemic contradiction. The two prisoners accompanying Sergeant Hitzinger, who were, in reality, highly loyal and decorated SS adjutants, Werner Grothmann and Heinz Macher, were instinctively deferring to a man of supposedly inferior rank. The camouflage protocol collapsed under the weight of its own internal friction. Grothmann and Macher were physically carrying the sergeant's luggage. They were stepping aside to open doors for him. They were maintaining the physical spacing and deferential posture demanded by a Reichsfuhrer. In a processing facility where thousands of exhausted, defeated soldiers and civilians were being herded through intake lines like industrial components, these isolated acts of programmed subservience functioned like a mechanical alarm bell. The illusion of the weary, low-ranking soldier was shattered not by Allied intelligence, but by the deeply ingrained psychological programming of Himmler's own subordinates. The British Army's bureaucratic processing apparatus reacted to this behavioral friction exactly as it was designed to. Sylvester recognized that the men were shielding a high-value asset hidden within the massive civilian population triage. The system immediately pivoted to isolate the anomaly. The low-ranking sergeant with the black eye patch and the perfectly forged papers was separated from the general processing line and routed directly into the camp commandant's office for an escalated direct contact interrogation. The mechanical unmasking had begun. By 1800 hours, the administrative friction at Civilian Interrogation Camp 031 had escalated from a behavioral anomaly to a targeted isolation protocol. Camp Commandant Captain Thomas Sylvester bypassed the standard civilian triage queues, which were currently buckling under the logistical strain of processing over 15,000 detained German personnel and displaced refugees per week, a throughput operating at nearly 140% of the facility's engineered capacity. The short, balding man carrying the forged Hitzinger documents was separated from the mass holding pens and routed directly into Sylvester's utilitarian office for a direct contact interrogation. The systemic pressure acting upon the prisoner was absolute. The British civilian processing apparatus relied on high-density containment, frequently packing upwards of 500 captured Wehrmacht regulars, SS personnel, and civilian detainees into single, minimally supervised holding sectors. For the former Reichsfuhrer, this presented a fatal statistical probability. Just weeks prior, in his unauthorized surrender negotiations with the Western Allies had resulted in a broadcasted denunciation from Berlin, stripping him of all rank. The mechanical reality was undeniable. Inserting this specific biological asset into a general population cell of betrayed, heavily combat-fatigued German soldiers and displaced civilians carried a near-guaranteed rate of lethal physical attrition. He was not experiencing a sudden attack of conscience or a desire to face justice. He was executing a calculated biological triage to simply survive the processing phase. Facing the immediate threat of the holding pens, the prisoner abandoned his evasion doctrine. The unmasking was a precise physical recalibration. He reached up and removed the black canvas eye patch, a crude piece of low-visibility camouflage that had fundamentally failed its primary objective. In its place, he equipped his signature circular, wire-rimmed optical lenses. The transformation from a degraded, low-ranking logistical nuisance to the supreme architect of a bureaucratic terror apparatus that once commanded 38 combat divisions was instantaneous. He stood before the British commandant, braced his posture, and formally declared his true identity, expecting the traditional protocols of high-level military surrender. In standard military doctrine, the revelation of a supreme enemy commander triggers an immediate high-friction operational response. Secured perimeters, rapid communication relays, and the formal salutes recognizing the rank of an opposing general. But the Reichsführer SS wasn't being unmasked in a grand military fortress. He was being processed in a civilian triage center. The British administrative machine in May 1945 was operating on total logistical exhaustion. The system did not view Himmler as a terrifying warlord. It categorized him as a high-maintenance administrative burden requiring specialized extraction. Captain Sylvester did not stand. He did not issue a military salute or acknowledge the enemy rank. Confronted with the man responsible for the industrial-scale slaughter of millions, the British systemic response was a delivery of absolute mechanical indifference. Sylvester simply looked at the asset and stated, "Oh, it's you." In 3 words, the most feared man in Europe was effectively stripped of his historical weight, reduced to a verified data point waiting for his final biological audit. Once the anomaly at internment camp 031 was verified, the systemic response escalated rapidly up the Allied chain of command, triggering the immediate involvement of Colonel Michael Murphy, Chief of Intelligence for the 2nd British Army. Operating under the crushing logistical strain of classifying over 1.5 million capitulated German personnel across the northern operational theater, Murphy's intelligence apparatus could not afford administrative delays. The directive issued from headquarters was a rigid, unyielding operational mandate: isolate the asset, initiate a full physical extraction of all garments, and ensure the complete neutralization of any concealed chemical payloads. Allied intelligence had thoroughly documented the German High Command's standard evasion doctrine. High-ranking Nazi officials were universally equipped with a highly specific fail-safe mechanism: a standard-issue 9mm brass casing housing a 1 cubic centimeter glass ampule of highly concentrated potassium cyanide. To secure the asset for the impending Nuremberg tribunals, the British system initiated a Level 4 biological audit. The prisoner was transported to a secure, temperature-uncontrolled interrogation room to undergo the mandatory intake protocol. Recognizing the complete collapse of his Hitzinger camouflage, the asset attempted to deploy his former bureaucratic authority as a defensive countermeasure. He verbally protested the physical handling, formally invoking his legal title as Reichsführer SS. Attempting to activate the diplomatic exemptions historically associated with a supreme military commander. Within a functioning German command structure, this verbal output would have commanded immediate, lethal compliance. However, against the cold, mechanical friction of the British internment machine, the title generated zero administrative traction. The British sergeant major tasked with the physical audit did not negotiate, nor did he acknowledge the historical weight of the target. When verbal non-compliance was registered, the system applied an immediate physical override. The extraction of the prisoner's garments was executed with blunt mechanical force. It was a rapid, unceremonious triage, a necessary operational attrition designed strictly to locate concealed contraband within the seams, collars, and hems of the heavy wool uniform. The supreme architect of the Schutzstaffel was forcefully stripped naked, subjected to the exact clinical, unfeeling reality of a standard hostile prisoner intake process. There is a profound mathematical symmetry embedded within this operational phase. For over a decade, this specific biological entity had engineered a continental logistics network explicitly designed to systematically strip, categorize, inventory, and liquidate human beings on an unprecedented industrial scale. Now, that same overarching methodology of mechanical erasure was being applied to him by a superior, indifferent bureaucratic dragnet. He was entirely stripped of his terrifying operational radius. He was no longer a warlord dictating the deployment of armored divisions, but merely Prisoner 031, shivering on the floor of a holding cell while his physical dimensions were categorized and audited by hostile security personnel. The myth of the untouchable SS was unraveling in a cold interrogation room. If you're fascinated by the forensic dismantling of history's darkest regimes, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an operational breakdown like this. Following the forced removal of the prisoner's garments, the British administrative machine initiated the next phase of the biological audit, a strict medical examination. The operational objective was to locate and neutralize any concealed chemical evasion mechanisms before the intelligence asset could be transferred to a secure long-term holding facility for the Nuremberg tribunals. This critical triage phase was assigned to Army Medical Officer Captain C.J. Jimmy Wells of the Royal Army Medical Corps. Operating in a cold, poorly illuminated interrogation room, Wells began a systematic, quadrant-by-quadrant physical inspection of the prisoner's discarded clothing. The initial phase of the audit yielded a mechanical success. Embedded within the rough fabric, Wells located the primary failsafe, a small, precision-machined brass case. Inside this specialized housing was a standard-issue SS suicide payload, a glass vial containing a lethal volume of liquid hydrocyanic acid, also known as Prussic acid. Unlike a slow-acting solid compound, this specific payload was engineered for rapid aerosolization and immediate mucosal uptake. To put the lethal efficiency of this payload into perspective, a systemic absorption of merely 1 cubic centimeter of this liquid solution is mathematically guaranteed to induce rapid cellular asphyxiation in an adult male within minutes. The British medical personnel immediately confiscated the brass casing. However, this operational victory came at a stiff price. It created a fatal cognitive blind spot within the triage process. The extraction of the primary mechanism generated a false sense of procedural security, masking the mechanical redundancy built into the Nazi high command evasion doctrine. The prisoner appeared externally compliant, standing naked in the center of the room, yet the British internment protocol had failed to mandate physical restraints on the subject's jaw during the inspection. The critical friction point occurred during the anatomical inspection of the asset's oral cavity. Wells instructed the prisoner to open his mouth for a standard internal check. As the medical officer brought a handheld diagnostic light closer to the subject's face, the focused beam revealed a glaring structural anomaly. Lodged deeply within the buccal mucosa, wedged tightly between the interior cheek wall and the lower molar teeth, was a small distinctive object. It was the secondary mechanism, a backup glass ampule engineered specifically to bypass external pat-downs and standard visual searches. Recognizing the immediate catastrophic threat of asset liquidation, Wells was forced to abandon procedural pacing. He shouted the direct command, "Spit it out!" and lunged forward, thrusting his bare hand toward the prisoner's mouth in a frantic attempt to manually extract the payload. It was a desperate, improvised triage against a highly engineered failsafe, and the British physical intervention simply lacked the necessary velocity. Witnessing the incoming physical override, Himmler executed his final, irreversible countermeasure. He violently jerked his cranial axis backward, successfully evading the doctor's fingers, and immediately clamped his jaw shut. The mechanical pressure generated by the human bite, easily exceeding the 150 to 200 pounds of localized occlusal force necessary to crush the fragile 1 millimeter thick glass casing, shattered the ampule instantly. The structural integrity of the vial collapsed, rapidly dumping the concentrated liquid hydrocyanic acid directly into the highly vascularized tissues of the prisoner's mouth. Because it was a liquid solution rather than a dry chemical salt, the compound began to vaporize almost immediately within the warm oral cavity, exponentially accelerating the lethal cascade. The British intelligence apparatus had successfully intercepted the target, broken his behavioral camouflage, and stripped him of his physical authority. But at the absolute final millimeter of the medical audit, the processing machine suffered a total systemic failure. The moment the 1 millimeter thick glass ampule shattered under the mechanical pressure of the prisoner's jaw, the operational parameters in the interrogation room shifted from a biological audit to an emergency chemical liquidation triage. The payload was not a slow-acting solid salt. It was concentrated liquid hydrocyanic acid, recognized within the German military apparatus as Prussic acid. Engineered for maximum lethal efficiency, the liquid immediately aerosolized upon contact with the warm mucosal lining and saliva of the oral cavity. This rapid phase change from liquid to vapor exponentially accelerated absorption, initiating a catastrophic blockade of the cytochrome C oxidase enzymes within the mitochondria of the subject's cells. This is not a dramatic cinematic event. It is a rigid mathematical cascade of cellular asphyxiation, permanently shutting down the body's ability to synthesize adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, rendering ambient oxygen completely useless to the brain and heart tissue. The British systemic response was instantaneous, driven by the absolute intelligence imperative of preserving the asset for the impending war crimes tribunals. The colonel commanding the extraction shouted a direct operational directive: "We need him for Nuremberg." But the medical apparatus available at Civilian Interrogation Camp 031 was entirely unequipped to reverse a weaponized chemical cascade of this velocity. Instead of a refined surgical intervention, the British personnel resorted to blunt, mechanical friction. Several soldiers physically descended upon the convulsing asset, treating the supreme architect of the SS as a malfunctioning hydraulic system. They grabbed the prisoner by his legs and forcefully hoisted his entire body weight, an estimated 170 pounds of dead, thrashing mass, completely upside down. The operational objective was to utilize raw gravity as a crude mechanical pump to physically expel any ingested poison from the subject's gastric tract before it could fully breach the blood-brain barrier. This improvised triage came at a stiff price of extreme physical chaos. Suspended inverted over the floor, the asset's biological systems began to violently crash as the central nervous system misfired under total cellular oxygen starvation. British medical personnel initiated a secondary physical override, forcefully pouring volumes of water down the inverted prisoner's throat and administering rapid-acting emetics to induce violent gastric purging. It was a brutal, unglamorous collision of brute physical force deployed against irreversible chemistry. Soldiers strained against the violent muscle spasms of a nervous system undergoing rapid toxic degradation, their boots slipping on the wet floor as they attempted to manually override the asset's collapsing respiratory drive. Despite the application of overwhelming physical force and emergency emetics, the arithmetic of the liquid-chemical payload was absolute. Because the prussic acid had aerosolized upon glass fracture, the lethal molecules had already saturated the highly vascularized tissues of the mouth and entered the bloodstream directly, completely bypassing the stomach. The cyanide molecules bound to the iron within the cellular mitochondria at a velocity that mathematically outpaced the crude mechanical flushing of his digestive tract. The frantic triage window was exceedingly brief. Within exactly 15 minutes of the initial structural collapse of the ampule, the violent neurological thrashing ceased entirely. The physical resistance collapsed, and the biological asset went permanently inert. The British intelligence apparatus possessed the logistical might to crush the German war machine and the bureaucratic dragnet to successfully isolate the highest-ranking fugitive in Europe. But in that cold interrogation room, the administration of military justice was superseded by the unbreakable laws of fluid dynamics and cyanide physics. The most valuable intelligence asset of the Second World War was dead on the floor, leaving the British system with nothing but a rapidly cooling logistical liability. With the cessation of the subject's neurological thrashing, the British internment apparatus was forced to execute an immediate operational pivot. The high-value intelligence asset they required for the Nuremberg tribunals had successfully self-liquidated, leaving the Second British Army with a rapidly cooling 170-pound logistical liability. The systemic objective instantly shifted from intelligence extraction to post-mortem damage control. The overarching threat was no longer Himmler's tactical command of the SS, but his potential post-war transformation into a martyred ideological symbol for remaining neo-fascist insurgencies. The British response to this threat was a masterclass in bureaucratic triage. They would weaponize his unglamorous end and physically delete his historical footprint. The first phase of this systemic erasure was forensic documentation. The military apparatus recognized that rumors of a heroic escape or a dignified last stand would inevitably propagate if the biological reality of his death was not strictly categorized and broadcasted. Military photographers were dispatched to the interrogation room to capture the mechanical aftermath of the potassium cyanide payload. There was no effort to prepare the body, arrange the limbs, or provide the standard dignified framing afforded to a fallen general. The resulting photographs were stark, high-contrast visual records of chemical asphyxiation. They documented the supreme architect of the Holocaust lying semi-naked on a cold floor, wrapped in a coarse, repurposed army blanket, with his iconic wire-rimmed glasses still perched above a jaw locked in a rigid post-mortem grimace. These unglamorous data points were rapidly processed and fed directly into the global press syndicates, deliberately intended to demonstrate to the German populace that the terrifying myth of the SS had culminated in a cowardly, undignified collapse. Following the psychological operation, the British Intelligence Command addressed the physical remains. For nearly 72 hours, the corpse was retained while the operational parameters for its disposal were finalized. Intelligence officers issued a strict directive. The creation of a marked grave would inevitably generate a geographic focal point, a shrine for future political pilgrimages. To permanently neutralize this variable, the system mandated a protocol of total topographical anonymity. In the early morning hours of May 26, 1945, the administrative erasure was physically executed. A minimal logistical detail consisting of exactly 4 British soldiers was tasked with the disposal. The remains were loaded into the cargo bed of a standard military transport truck and driven outward into the Lüneburg Heath. The Heath was a vast, desolate geological zone encompassing thousands of square kilometers of repetitive scrubland, heather, and dense forest. It was a mathematically perfect environment for burying a statistical anomaly. The operational detail stopped at a randomized, unrecorded set of coordinates deep within the tree line. There were no chaplains present, no military honors rendered, and no procedural paperwork filed to document the specific location. The soldiers utilized standard entrenching tools to execute a hasty tactical burial, displacing roughly 40 cubic feet of sandy topsoil. They dug a pit that was strictly utilitarian, not a formalized grave, but a shallow topographical depression just deep enough to effectively mask the biological mass and prevent surface detection by local scavengers. The body was deposited into the void. The displaced earth was mechanically shoveled back into the cavity, and the soldiers initiated a final forensic camouflage protocol. They scattered ambient dead foliage, broken branches, and local leaves over the disturbed soil, painstakingly matching the chaotic visual texture of the surrounding forest floor. The soldiers were sworn to absolute operational secrecy, and they drove away without marking a single point on an ordnance map. The man who had engineered the most meticulously documented bureaucracy of mass murder in human history was intentionally reduced to a null value. Himmler thought he was the architect of a 1,000-year empire, but his legacy ended in a muddy, forgotten hole. It wasn't a grand cinematic ending. It was the grim, systemic justice of a world moving on without him. If you want to keep exploring the brutal truths and mechanical realities of history, hit subscribe right now. I'll see you in the next briefing.